So welcome all. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be covering off a topic around diversifying your retrofit funding, exploring options to make grant funding go further. So we're clearly now in the midst of some of the largest grant funds to date to deliver housing retrofit with the Warm Homes Social Housing Fund and the Warm Homes Local Grant, which were launched this year. But we also know that grant funding alone isn't going to cut it when it comes to retrofitting social homes to EPCC, let alone net zero carbon, and to bring people out of fuel poverty. So that's why we want to cover this topic. I'm Andrew Todd. I'm the head of energy transformation at Sureserve, and I'll be joined by Jamie Abbott from Climate Programme Partners and Matt Conroy from Unity Trust Bank. We'll be talking you through these themes. What we'll be covering in terms of contents, I'll be giving you some background to the retrofit policy and funding landscape, and then some kind of key tips on how to make existing grant funding go further. Jamie's then going to dive into revenue generating retrofit projects with kind of a lens on solar and financed options there. And then Matt's going to cover off sources of private funding and finance. And then we should have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So do submit any questions as they pop up into the Q&A function. We'll cover them off at the end. So as a bit of scene setting, I wanted to kind of talk through the housing retrofit funding and policy landscape over the last 25 years or so. So picked out some of the key policies, which are in italics on the slide, and the funding sources, which have really helped to lay the foundations for developing warmer, safer, healthier homes, which are more energy efficient and lower carbon. So starting from the early 2000s, we had the Warm Front scheme and the Decent Homes standard. Decent Homes was introduced to provide a quality standard for people living in social housing, and it included elements of thermal comfort and thermal performance. We then had EPCs introduced in 2007, which are really to drive standard metrics when it comes to energy performance in buildings. And they're still, to this date, underpinning some of the grant schemes in terms of eligibility and compliance expectations. In 2008, we had the Climate Change Act launch, which commits the UK to legally binding climate targets with carbon budgets set in and long-term emission cuts aimed for. We also had CERT and CESP. So these are two programs that delivered nearly 300,000 energy efficiency measures to about 150,000 homes, which was led by energy companies as a kind of precursor to the ECO program. Both broadly seen as a success in terms of the rollout of significant number of fairly simple measures, such as loft and cavity wall. But there were also some fairly significant failures where poor quality installation has led to damp and mold in homes and huge remediation requirements. I think most notably it's the Fishwick estate example in Preston. Various schemes then launched in the 2010s, including things like the feed-in tariff and renewable heat incentive, which are designed to ignite the market for renewable energy, electricity generating and heat generating. And then in 2016, we had the Each Home Counts review, which was brought in to kind of look more closely at consumer advice and consumer protection when it comes to the delivery of energy efficiency schemes, possibly off the back of some of the poor quality delivery in certain CESP. Each Home Counts has led to the development of a new quality framework, which is PAS 2035, which was introduced in 2019 and is now mandatory for all the government grant-funded schemes. In 2018, we also had the MEES minimum energy efficiency standards launch, which requires the private rented sector to reach EPC-E for any properties that are rented. And there's proposals which have been put out there recently to bring that up to an EPC-C. And then as we move into the early 2020s, there was a series of different waves of grant funding launched covering both the social housing sector, but also private homes, which are likely to be in fuel poverty across both England, Scotland and Wales. And that's really kind of led to where we are now in terms of Warm Homes Wave 3 and Warm Homes Local Grant, which is the biggest pot of grant funding to date that we've seen, with over about £1.5 billion available for retrofitting homes. We've also recently seen the introduction of a WAB's law, so a strengthening of some of the regulatory requirements governing how people live in social housing. And we're eagerly anticipating the launch of the Warm Homes Plan, which may or may not come out before Christmas, but that should help to outline how the 13.5 plus 1.5 billion is going to be spent over the next 4 or 5 years. Also next year, we'll be waiting the results of some of the consultations which happened this year, which will govern standards and retrofit in social homes. Things like MEES for social housing, so whether or not a minimum EPCC band will be introduced. There's the EPC reform, which I think has been longly awaited, to improve how EPCs provide information and how buildings are assessed. And then also Decent Homes 2, which we should hear about next year. So if we look at the direction of travel, what we've seen in that timeline is a significant mix of grants and loans and subsidies and tariffs. Some are focused on off-gas grid homes, some on-gas grid, and a mix of housing tenures being covered, but with a real lean towards homes that are likely to be in fuel poverty and social housing. And there's been a significant increase in funding over the years. So we've seen growth in the SHDF pots of money from the demonstrator through Wave 1 up to where we're at with Wave 3. Those significant orders of magnitude higher in terms of what's available. We've also seen a bit of a shift from the kind of single measure, one size fits all delivery to multiple measures and more of a kind of local based approach. In the last slide, we saw that the devolution funding's been introduced, giving certain combined authority regions more autonomy of how they deliver retrofit. We've seen the growth of Fabric First and the whole house movement, which is kind of introduced under PAS 2035 and the Warm Home, the Each Home Counts review. But I think a bit of pushback from the sector of late on whether or not Fabric First is driving the right outcomes for all homes, and a bit of a drive towards more flexibility around how decarbonisation is delivered, some of which Jamie will cover in his talk. There has certainly been an increased focus on low carbon heating, which we think we're likely to see as heat remains one of the largest sources of carbon in homes. And then we've seen that tightening of regulatory standards to really drive better performance and better outcomes for those living in social homes and private rented homes. And then lastly, whilst we know that Eco4 has been likely to be extended until December, we have also heard recently about its scrappage in the budget announcements. That's likely to have been a combination of government looking for ways to reduce everyone's electricity bill by taking those tariffs off the electricity proportion of the bill, but also the results of a damning National Audit Office report on the quality of delivery of, albeit a small sample, of external wall and internal wall insulation in homes. So the full ramifications of scrapping eco, I think, it's still to be determined, and it is a significant source of funding that was out there targeting fuel poor homes, which hasn't directly been replaced. In terms of the implications then for delivery, what does it mean to those who are kind of delivering the schemes, housing providers, and also the supply chain? Well, it's likely to mean an increased focus on quality, so making sure that you're able to deliver quality and prove it. We think that funders are going to demand more evidence of safe installations that are durable, long-lasting, and achieving the outcomes that were designed. It's likely to mean more enforcement, I think, around that. So more strengthening of quality assurance, more around installer competence and supply chain management, which is going to be central to that success. And then more local authority-led programs are likely to come through as we see more devolution of funding happening. What it means in terms of programs, I think it's going to mean more flexibility in technology and how decarbonisation is delivered. And then also looking at programs that link more sources of funding rather than just relying on grant and capital budget. So that's hopefully what we're going to cover off in some of the talks today. So just a few tips from me then before I pass on to Jamie about how you can make your grant funding go further. And simply, it's bucketed into these 4 areas. So better data and planning. That means doing upfront stock modeling to really understand your stock and where you've got priority areas for investment. Those could be grouped around specific measures or specific homes, as we're seeing in that kind of archetype measure-based programs, which can really help to reduce the cost of delivery and streamline things in terms of your supply chain engagement. In terms of data, you also should look at developing kind of long-term asset investment plans that link retrofit to other aspects, like asset replacement of your windows, your doors, your heating systems, and also linked to building safety. And then lastly, understand the root causes of damp, mold, and condensation within your homes. With the WAB's law coming into force, it's not going to be any good to take just a reactive approach to go in, wash the mold away, redecorate, and move on. You need to get to the bottom of what is causing damp and mold within these homes and address it. And retrofit could be a significant way to tackle that. In terms of looking at long-term partnerships, then, by developing longer-term partnerships with your supply chain, it can really help on reducing procurement costs and reducing the time to mobilize these programs. And we have, in those timelines I showed earlier, seen an increase in the delivery windows and grant funding over time. But there's no need just to look at the funding delivery window. Develop longer term programs that are then flexible for future funding waves as they come through. This can be, on a more shared risk and reward basis with your contractors and your supply chain. And it can lead to more predictable pricing and allow your supply chain partners to really invest in skills and quality. I've touched on archetype and measure-based programs to really focus in and kind of deliver specific measures in specific areas and do that well. And then lastly, looking at kind of combining multiple sources of funding. So you can blend funding across private and across different funding streams, so long as you're meeting all the requirements of each individual stream. And I'll then pass on to Jamie, who's going to delve into some additional sources of funding for you to consider. Jamie, over to you.
Right, thanks, Andy. Great introduction, and it was really interesting little history there, going back a bit before the Green Deal and into some earlier schemes there. I think I saw some interesting conversation on that in LinkedIn. And wow, there's a lot of change. There's been a lot of change over the years in a fairly short time, 20 years, to have gone through so many sequential schemes. It's pretty impactful on the supply chain, on relationship, continuity, on the need for continual update and increase in knowledge. And I think one of the reasons that financed solar, which we're going to talk about now, is interesting is because of that constant shift and change and waves of different policy approaches from government and changing governments over that time. And I think this sector is in the real need of something that goes a little bit on a self-driven market. And so it's felt like the sort of tantalizing vision over the horizon for quite a long time. Perhaps with this stuff, we might be getting towards something that could finance itself, and something therefore that leaves us with a little less volatility dependent on government grant cycles. That said, And what we can talk about here is finance solar is not wholly standalone at this time. The finances don't quite stack up to be completely free of the need for investment, either by landlords or by through grant funding. But it does offer a glimmer and a light ahead that perhaps reduces that reliance and gives us a little bit more of a sector that might persist beyond the grant funding cycles. Well, a really interesting one, Andy, just to map onto that flow of changing policies. That I saw someone shared something similar, not going quite so far back, but showing the uptake in investment across those changing cycles. And what you always get is a massive dip at the beginning of a new one of those schemes. And so what you've got is this incredible sawtooth going throughout the last 20 years of ups and downs of market, which make it really hard for everyone involved, not least contractors and supply chain like Sureserve and others. But it really stops the momentum. So a little background on me. Been in the housing sector for about 20 years, first with clients like L&Q and Circle, now Clarion. Spent about 10 years working with large consultancies, first Capita, then Turner & Townsend, where my primary client base was the Greater London Authority, and we ran the retrofit accelerator programs for about 10 years for the GLA. First called Renew, then the retrofit accelerator for homes. That then grew and ballooned into what is now the national service, supporting DESNZ in the rollout of the SHF and local grant programs, and prior to that the previous wave. So a history of coming through this sector, growing a national team, and then leading those major contracts. And then set up on my own about 18 months ago, and I've worked with Sureserve and a number of others, including West Midlands Authority and Bristol City Leap, and working on helping with commercial leadership and program excellence. This needs to be a commercial model. We need to grow. We need the supply chain to have an ability to grow and create resilience, and we need the public sector to be able to dispense money and to carry out work quicker. And just a vote for Andy's point on longer term partnerships, because we're seeing at the moment that dip in wave 3 delivery due to procurement. So that's where I am. I'm currently done about 6 months work focused on, well, spent the last 2 years, frankly, looking at the gap between funding and finance and funding and costs. At the moment, if you tally up the total, whilst it's significant, the total investment in the SHDF program, now SHF, we're getting to about 2.2 billion so far in that area, and around £1 billion spent through HUG and local grant, or allocated through HUG and local grant. Wave 3, so in the region of 3 billion so far. Even with eco, we're less than 10 billion pounds spent through government so far. Estimated costs for bringing the social housing sector alone towards sort of net zero target is around 100 billion. So we're far short of the cost through government grant. Government grant cannot and will not bridge that gap. So whilst we're seeing good progress, we're nowhere near where we need to be in terms of cost. How do we bridge that gap? And he's mentioned a few things: efficiencies, getting going. We need to reduce the ups and downs, and we need to work out ways of optimizing our program spend by setting out clear strategies, insulating roofs when we replace them, by embracing new technologies, potentially like batteries and such, that perhaps can reduce fuel poverty without the cost and time constraints and technical risks of EWI in some places, though fabric measures probably still needed somewhere in some places. Here we're going to talk about finance. So can we reduce that? First, can we reduce that cost? Second, can we pay for the remaining gap? So there's a big gap. Well, how do we do that? Well, there's increasing interest in this financing area. It was a strategic priority, and some of the organisations here might have picked up on that on Wave 3 funding applications, was to trial financing approaches. We've got the likes of Living Places pursuing a kind of net zero neighbourhoods model and really testing out how we can bring building business cases together. We've got the National Wealth Fund set up with a support service for local authorities to try to work out and help and provide some guidance. Really interesting team there if you're in a local authority to get in touch with. They've got some support around investment models. Wave 4 funding, I think is expected to come out. Given the trajectory to date, I would expect that to be bigger than Wave 3. We've got additional commitment to that agenda through the budget. We don't yet know how much of the 13.2 billion will be spent on housing, but there's a pretty high chance, I think, that we're going to see some of that funding allocated to getting this financing approach going. And when I've spent quite some time looking at this, when we're looking at the financing options, solar and battery currently the primary option that can pay itself back. There is some potential in ground source heat pumps, but they're very expensive to install. It needs the right type of setup and some significant grant funding to help. Perhaps there's a future where air source heat pumps become viable, perhaps alongside solar and battery. Maybe there's a scenario where you can underscore the energy performance through insulation, but that's a long way off. So solar and batteries look like the primary option. There's some demos done. This is quite a big one out in Wales, Pobble, done by Ciro, who I was working with last year as the Chief Commercial Officer, and some interesting stuff on some large blocks in Hackney, and then some private sector stuff in Oxfordshire. So we've got the seed of a business model that can work, and I'm just going to go through here to show some of the basics of how that business model works. So what we're seeing, there's 4 or 5, depending how you cut it, organisations who are offering a kind of a financed or rather I think a shared savings model of solar with batteries installed at scale for social housing. It's shared savings, as in the resident needs to save some money, of course. The investor, which could be the landlord, the housing association, needs some money back in order to pay for the capital investment. The other scenario is you just pay for it, which is inaffordable in the long term. I think we won't go into all the details of this, but rather go through to the capital funding model. So it's still, if you want a commercial rate of return, we need to be able to fund about half of the cost of the solar and batteries, either from grant or from landlord reserves. Potentially, there's a few large organisations already doing this under Wave 3. They're using the grant to match finance, either external financed investment for the solar or internal application of capital investment from the housing association. Those come together into a pot to spend, and then about half of that can be recovered at a commercial rate. Potentially, you could do this to recover a part of your investment as a landlord. The revenue stack works like this. Say, roughly speaking, you've got £1,000 on resident bills. Installing the solar and battery model can reduce that resident bill effectively, not quite, but potentially to 0, if you add up the on-site generation stored in the battery, used off-peak, used during peak times, the battery topped up by import during off-peak times, potentially a negative value, and then supplemented by flexibility services to the grid. So with that, potentially you might get something like the original resident bill back in terms of income or potential savings. Give 20% of that or something like that to the resident and use the remainder to pay back your investment. This sort of stuff has been done at scale. Before, in 2015, we had a massive, not massive, could have been bigger, but quite a lot of organisations invested at scale in solar using the feed-in tariff. But quite a few also investigated this and then pulled back because they were worried about various risks, and it's worth being aware of that. This type of scheme is new. It's a bit of a paradigm change for housing providers, but ultimately, if we're going to tackle net zero and warmer home and affordable homes, we're probably going to need to go down this route. But it will take determination and a degree of creativity amongst boards and executives and teams managing properties. There are risks to be worked through. I don't think they're I don't think they are risks that can't be managed, but they need to be articulated and managed. Will policy pull the rug on supporting solar and battery? Will right to buy create issues? There are technical workarounds actually, and I'm quite impressed by what these suppliers are offering now. Will people pay their bills? Will it live up to the expected performance standard? I think probably it will these days, as long as it's well specified. And will residents, take up the offer? Will there be good customer services? There have been schemes under FITs that haven't gone well in terms of customer service, and that needs to be applied well. So I think, I think I'll leave it at that. If you're interested in more, then get in touch. And I'll pass over to Matt.
Thanks, Jamie. Lots of interesting comments and thoughts and observations there. Thanks, everyone, including the audience, for joining, and to Sureserve for the opportunity to talk a little bit about Unity, the role we play in this conversation, and the initiatives that we have come up with as a small bank operating in the UK. To introduce Unity, if you haven't heard of us before, we are in the context of UK banking, we are a minnow, we are tiny, by which I mean we've got a loan book of 1.1 billion, which is a lot, but is not a lot in the context of UK banking. Unity was established in the mid-1980s with a mission to do good with money. We provide full banking, current account banking, deposits, accounts and loans for not-for-profits, social enterprises and SMEs, for-profit organisations, all of whom delivering some form of positive social or environmental outcomes. Particularly in our lending, we're very conscious of making the right choices and supporting projects that are doing good. So although we're small, what we do aim to do is punch above our weight in terms of innovation. We always proud of whenever we can lead by example, be the first to do something and then shout about it, and hopefully others will follow in the banking sector. So kind of a campaigner, I suppose, to some extent as well. We have been the first to do a few things, not least achieve fair tax accreditation, adopting things such as the PCAF partnership for carbon accounting financials. I believe we were certainly the first bank to invest in housing association charitable trust carbon credits, and then we recently received Good Egg Award. Possibly not the first bank to receive that, but it was a recent thing that we're proud of. And we're also quite bold in our own commitments. So we have a commitment to achieve net zero across our own operational emissions by 2035, and to achieve net zero across all emissions by 2045. You might wonder, well, what's the difference? The 2045 commitment includes reducing the carbon output of our loan book. So we need to do quite a lot of work to use our lending to support projects and organisations with reducing carbon emissions. And that drives some of the initiatives that we come up with, which I'm going to talk through a couple of today. One of the things I wanted to touch on was the private finance landscape and how it is different for small and large providers, housing association and social housing providers. As a small bank, we're predominantly engaged with small to medium-sized housing associations in our lending, and in talking to them, we understand that whilst there are funding solutions out there, often they can be difficult to access for a smaller organisation. So we have gone on our own journey of trying to support our customers, i.e. smaller housing associations, with solutions that mirror but aren't necessarily exactly the same as the solutions available to the larger organisations. I'm just going to jump on for a sec. Andy, my screen has just gone really big and I can't now see the slides, so apologies for going that off slightly. Thank you.
We can still see them, yeah, it's fine.
Sorry, it just changed a bit. So I just jumped ahead a slide just to explain something. So our journey and the things we've done include developing an offer for customers we've called it the Retrofit Transition Initiative for housing associations, which we launched in 2022. It proved quite popular, and we doubled the amount allocated to that in 2024 to 50 million. That's not a massive sum, but for us as a small bank, it is a reasonably large commitment. To date, that initiative has supported over 1,000 homes having their energy efficiency improved, reducing the bills for the residents, and has been, we think, quite a success. And actually won an award at the Unlock Net Zero Awards this year. So I just jumped ahead a slide to explain that, because in developing that offer, we explored the history of and the availability of green loans and retrofit funding sources from banks to see how a Unity offer could fit into the mix. And just on that history, Loan Market Association launched its sustainability-linked loan principles some years ago, and they've been adopted in various forms by lenders. But they do come with, or those terms do include usually annual environmental covenants, which sit alongside your annual financial covenants. And we realised that for some of our customers, they represented a jeopardy, and customers were concerned that if they didn't meet those covenants in a future year, then they may lose the advantage of the favourable pricing, advantage of the retrofit terms. I talked about our commitment to net zero, but we're conscious that other lenders as well are also keen to reduce the carbon impact of their lending activity. And as a result, we've seen even organisations that can't benefit, even lenders who haven't been able to benefit from the National Wealth Fund Retrofit Loans Guarantee Scheme, introducing their own version of green lending or green tariff or green terms, which don't carry the benefit of the guarantee and are really done at cost to the lender. We're aware that larger loans typically achieve more favourable pricing. That's not surprising. It's economies of scale. Larger banks are able to be more competitive on pricing. Larger borrowers are more able to avail of that more favourable pricing. But green lending terms, whichever the lender, usually attract more favourable pricing. And there are offers available from ethical banks, including Unity, and are worth exploring, even if they're not very overtly publicly advertised. Anyway, so I did jump ahead to this slide, so I'm going to not talk about the retrofit transition initiative anymore on this slide, but I do want to mention our local climate bonds, where we were seeking alternatives to just traditional lending, and have engaged with an offer created by Abundance, and we have committed to investing £15 million in local climate bonds, which are available to local authorities. They are repayable finance, but local authorities can use the grant funding to deliver local initiatives that address the climate challenge quite locally. Typically, environmental could include tree planting, forest initiatives, drainage initiatives, and projects that address warming, and particularly kind of hyper concentrated warming that we get in high built up areas. We're quite pleased with that so far. It was only a recent this year thing, and of our 15 million commitments, I think we've actually just tipped over the 4 million of it being availed of so far. The reason I'm mentioning this in this context is that as a housing association, often you will have land or even other homes owned by a local authority adjacent to your stock, and that engaging with a local authority may enable your residents, your properties to benefit adjacently from some form of investment by the local authority, which could avail of the local climate bond. And also, just to mention that as a small bank ethical organisation, it's an example of something that, being a bit creative, that we can do that's not just traditional lending. I've got one more slide, which is a case study of one of our customers that I mentioned to Andy, and he thought was interesting, and I agree it is interesting. So Chisel Housing Association is a very small housing association. Typically our customers have between a few hundred and a few thousand homes. Chisel is at the smaller end of that scale with 250 homes, established similar timeline to us in the mid-1980s, and it's also a G320 member and ambitious. It operates in South East London, Brighton and Colchester, and was a beneficiary of a Wave 3 grant confirmed this year, one of the largest Wave 3 grants for a smaller housing association. And the concept of match funding was touched on earlier. The reason I just wanted to mention this project is that a Unity retrofit transition initiative loan is the source of the match funding, and just to explore that match funding doesn't need to come from cash reserves. It can come from a lender source, and most lenders would be willing for that to be the purpose of their loan, to be the match funding for a grant. I'm going to apologise. I lost track slightly there because the slides are in a slightly different order than I was expecting, but I think I covered everything I was intended to. I'm happy to move on to Q&A.
Well, you freestyled it very well there. Then. Great. Well, that takes us to Q&A, and we've had some come through in the chat already. So if you've got questions, please bung them in there. But we'll start with a question around smaller housing associations, which probably we'll go to you, Matt, but Jamie, please feel free to chip in. So what can the smaller housing associations do who perhaps don't have a lot of resource to do a lot of data and a lot of planning? What can they do to really get themselves in the best position for the next wave of funding that's coming around?
Well, we tend to signpost to Rise. I must confess, I've never gone through the process alongside a customer, but that for us has been the obvious thing to signpost to the Rise support offered by DESNES to help with planning, and project readiness. We, and I'm sure any other lender that is supporting retrofit through its lending, it is worth a conversation as well. So if you have an existing bank who have provided some debt, talk to your relationship manager, because they will have other customers who have been through the process, been through the journey, and may have may be able to offer some support from things they've heard, or to introduce you to another housing association. What's really nice about, of course, everyone knows this, but what's really nice about the sector is the inter-supportivity. I mentioned in connection with Chisel their membership of the G320, and that is a group of housing associations that are really inter-supportive and will, if someone comes across something that's useful to the others, they will share it. So I would explore peer support, talk to your bank about what's their experience been, and RISE.
Great, thanks, Matt. And I've learned a new word, which is inter-supportivity, and I don't see many opportunities to use that day to day. But I think that's a perfect one. Jamie, perhaps kind of building on that, another question that we've got through is, what's your view of consortium planning for smaller HAs or LAs to gain the benefits of economies of scale? Jamie, you might be on mute.
There you go. Mike, can you hear me now?
Yes, there you are.
Yeah. Consortium planning for small organisations. Well, I think what I would say is yes. Yes, go for it. I think the primary thing, which sort of speaks back to your previous question, is how to prepare for future funding rounds, and I think that goes for all organisations. Is start now, start early, start talking to the other people that you might work with. Consortia can work and have worked really well for some people, but they can also create an additional layer, a barrier, and I think getting the size right for that is really important. So I think clubbing together, yes, but personally, from what I've seen of the large consortia, they have their advantages in that you've got a degree of more flexibility, the ability to move funding between organisations, but it does create an administrative barrier. From where I've heard of really good examples of consortium working is with where one or two smaller organisations have buddied up with a larger and more mature organisation that has sort of quite slick processes, and therefore can have some quite dedicated or focused support with a smaller and more cohesive consortium. The big regional ones, the feedback I've heard from social housing providers is generally feeling a little bit distant and overly not enough management. I think starting early is really important, and I think in terms of setting up, the other thing I point again to your point, Andy, procure long-term partnerships. Give yourselves the ability to pull out if funding doesn't come through, performance is bad, or there are other reasons for it, but give yourself the ability to extend a contract. Far too much money, far too much disruption is caused by procuring in line with an existing or allocated funding round, only then to have to repeat it to no one's advantage in the future.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'd heard some great anecdotal examples under previous waves of SHDF of, housing associations with 4 or 5 homes to retrofit, just joining a bigger project of 400 or 500, their homes becoming a very small proportion of the delivery. It's very easy for the bigger provider to kind of assume that into their program with the contribution of the smaller HA. Great. Question for you, Matt, then from Jason. So does Unity Trust Bank loan to private companies or just social housing providers?
We lend to charities, social enterprises, SMEs, but for any loan, our first filter is the project making a positive impact toward one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So where we do lend to private companies, they are typically providing some form of service such as healthcare. We, for instance, support residential care homes and settings, childcare, for instance. But we're very conscious of only supporting those that do particular good, have employee engagement and policies that ensure that the service user experience is good and that employees are treated well. And we have a few measures for checking that is the case and is likely to continue being the case.
Great, thanks, Matt. Here's a tricky one. Is there any more data on Warmer Homes plan with regard to how this will be rolled out? When's it likely to start and finish? Method for bidding? The fear of removing eco-funding is that we will have a cliff edge gap before this is in place. Well, I'll have a stab at that, and we don't have sight of the Warm Homes plan yet, and I think we kind of need to wait patiently for it. But Jamie or Matt, do you have any other insight? Either when it's likely to arrive, any details of it?
Yeah, I mean, no formal and detailed information is available, but as far as I understand, it should come out in January. Now, I think the big changes have been made through the budget. I think that should come out in January as the Warm Homes plan. My bet or my estimate is that we see within that some detail of a wave 4, and that the actual policy detail of that will be published. Well, hopefully it'll be published before the summer, but it will come out to application in late next year with allocations early the following year, 2027. That would be the earliest I think it will come out is during that time kind of window. So maybe an application window in autumn next year. And allowing for perhaps an overlap between wave 3 and a wave 4. There's a very, very good chance on previous experience of that sort of timescale being optimistic, and that it comes out later, and that we have to have a race for the finish again. But the suggestion is that it'll be years 4 and 5. So Selwyn Brown was talking at the Homes conference. A year 4 and 5 should come, a wave 4 should come, and it is likely, based on previous trajectory, it's likely to be bigger. In total, I would suspect it will be lower in terms of in terms of grant per home, and I would expect there to be a more focus on clean heat and solar and batteries, and a increasingly reduced focus on fabric. Yeah.
Okay, guys. Well, you heard it here first, but we won't hold Jamie to those dates because, as you know, with government, it is ever changing. So we've had a question which I think is directed at me. So what does the ongoing devolution of local authorities mean for contractors like Sureserve? So I would suggest it means that we need to be closer in terms of building partnerships with local authorities and combined authorities and city regions. It means that we need to be flexible in terms of who we're delivering the retrofit projects to, be it across tenure and that flexibility that we spoke about earlier across technology, knowing that there's likely to be more flexibility in how people see decarbonisation. We're seeing a lot of heat network projects coming to the fore now, and I think that trend is likely to increase with housing retrofit associated with those. So in summary, I think it's about being more agile to the new types of project coming through, and making sure that we've got good long-term relationships with the people who are delivering. We've got another question then from James. can you confirm what the next step would be for a contractor to introduce a housing provider to explore options available? I'll take a quick stab and then pass to you, Jamie. So I think Matt's kind of summarized it. Options available for support. You probably direct them towards the RISE service set up by Turner and Townsend. They're there to really kind of guide people through how to apply for those big grant funds. In terms of broader support, though, in funding, the exploration of some of the themes that we've covered today in terms of private funding and then self-funded projects, I think any contractor should be able to provide at least some initial guidance on how to start along that journey. But Jamie, anything to build on there?
Yeah, I think talk to the RISE team is a really good idea. You get some nice briefings there. I mean, I think that's probably the place to start. I think it's not quite clear what you're saying actually in the question. Next step for a contractor to introduce a housing provider to explore options available. I don't know if you're talking about solar. Maybe give us a shout externally from this and let us know what the detail of your question is. But yeah, the RISE support is a good way to start.
Yeah, James, I'll put our contact details up in the end so you can get in touch with us. I've got a couple of questions as the kind of host's privilege. So, Matt, you spoke about projects that are addressing kind of warming, which I'm taking to assume is overheating within homes, which is obviously very closely linked to Awaab's law and the second phase likely to come in at some point next year, covering, very cold and very warm homes. So are you seeing any combinations of funding which are tackling housing retrofit and decarbonisation as well as climate adaptation?
No, disappointingly no. But I think the conversation is increasingly recognising, because we've had a couple of particularly hot summers or heat waves during the recent summers, that it's become more of a topic of conversation. We're not seeing grants addressing that, but we're seeking through our funding to support projects that have a heat reducing effect, particularly in city settings where we've got a lot of concrete and built mass. And they include smaller tree planting schemes. A couple of our customers in using our retrofit funding, as well as keeping homes warm, have added shading to south-facing walls and windows, which can have a quite significant effect on reducing the degrees centigrade that those homes are warmed by on a really hot spell. But yeah, no, disappointing on the grant funding, but I think the conversation is more going there, so we would expect that to change.
Great. Okay. And I would just add that within a retrofit project, the kind of critical aspect of ventilation is really important there and can't be ignored. I think there's a lot of misconceptions that by increasing the insulation, you're likely to kind of cause overheating, but I think that has been debunked as a bit of a myth, and it's about making sure you've got proper ventilation within your homes, and a good retrofit project, PAS 2035, should deliver that. I'll squeeze one more question in then, which would be probably for Jamie, but looking at solid walled homes and the challenges that we've seen with external and internal wall insulation, are these likely to get left behind when it comes to these big grant funds and the kind of more financeable projects? What's the solution you think for those?
So I think there's I think the funding will still allow for solid wall insulation. I just think it will be a lower proportion of funding than previously, and there'll be more emphasis on others. So I think it will be about choosing the properties that really need that, rather than with a higher bar for really needs that. And so there'll be an emphasis going towards the other stuff. I think the there's plenty of discussion, obviously, on whether you should do fabric or clean heat, and that's probably not. I don't think it's one or the other. I think, you know, people who have lower electricity bills might still be in cold homes, so we have to think about people's comfort as well as affordability. So I don't think they're left behind entirely. I think the idea here is probably to reduce the cost of doing the works to others, or at least pay back some of the cost for doing works to other homes, that allows for the sort of investment needed in those stone walled homes or solid walled homes that's needed from other funds.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Well, we'll call it time there because we're just at the hour, and just want to say a big thank you to Jamie and Matt for your time that's gone into this, the thoughts and the great kind of questions that you've answered. And thank you all for listening. Our contact details are on the screen if you wanted to continue the conversation or ask any further questions or clarity on the questions asked. So please do reach out. We'll call it a day there. So thank you all and take care.
Thank you.